All right, so welcome to our first of a 2-week series and a series of lectures and mock rounds on some specific skills that you guys should know for congressional debate. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Nick. I'm a coach at Youth Voices. I've been coaching for around 2 years now. I competed for 4 years before that. And my specialty in those 4 years of competition was early and mid-round speaking, actually. So I was not much of a late round speaker. A lot of my competitive success came from second and third cycle affirmation or negation speeches. That was really my specialty. I sponsored sometimes as well. I sponsored a lot towards my senior year, and I think it was around part of round strategy that I neglected a lot. So brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus on the first 4 speeches of the debate round. So the first 2 affirmatives and the first 2 negations. All right. So we're going to start with a broad overview of the strategy behind those 4 speeches, and then talk specifically about some of the common missteps that I see people making in the sponsorship, first negation, etc. Sound good? Super duper. All right. Oh, there we go. So the question that I want to start with is, why should you go early, right? So a lot of times when people teach camp, and a lot of the camps that you've probably, or lessons that you've probably done with us, there's a lot of emphasis on middle and late round speaking, right? And middle and late round speaking is often more technically difficult. And at least among debaters, it's often looked at as like the optimal time to go. And that is true sometimes, but there's good reasons to go early, right? So I'll go through the most common here. The most common reason that you would want to go early as a late round speaker is to set up speaking order. So in Congress, if you go first on the first bill, you could speak whenever you want on the second bill, right? That's how the rules work. If you go first negation, you could pretty much speak whenever you want to, right? The only person that has speaking order over you is the sponsor, right? So if you have a strategically good late round speech on bill 2, it's often sound to go early on bill 1. So the way this was put to me before, and I think this is a good analogy, is you have 2 speeches in a congressional debate round. The job of the first speech is to get you in the door, right? To put you in the top 6. The second speech is going to win you the round, right? So to be clear, you don't have to win the round on both of your speeches. You only have to win the round on one. The other speech just has to put you towards the top. Another thing that sponsoring or going early allows you to do is add variance into your speaking style. When you go later, you're more constrained because you have to answer certain arguments, refute certain arguments, and weigh certain arguments, right? This allows you to show diversity in your speaking by allowing for a slower, more rhetoric-heavy style, right? And I think the most important reason that people want to go neg is it helps you stand out, or not neg, sorry, early, is it helps you stand out in strong, flow-heavy rounds. So if you're in a debate with 8 or 9 strong middle and late round speakers, or 8 or 9 just strong debaters in general, it might be good to bite the bullet and sponsor or go early, right? Because that allows you to preempt a lot of the strong debaters by setting this tone for the debate, right? And this is especially effective if you notice a bunch of confused lay judges on the panel that don't entirely understand what's going on, right? Because giving an early sponsor for them is often potentially round winning. Cool. But don't just take like my word for it. Let's look at some of the theory here. So before we shifted to virtual debate in 2020, this often gets lost. The meta was very early round heavy. So starting at 2019 Harvard, the first and second place speakers, Rainin Miao and Luke Chalitsky, spoke first and second respectively. Rainin sponsored, Luke gave the first neg, right? In TOC of 2019, the champion, Rainin Miao, sponsored the second bill. In NSDA 2019, Hunter Brown and Rainin Miao both went early on several bills. They got, I think, first and second in House respectively. It's the 2018 like consensus #1 debater, Nick DeVito, won TOC, won NSDA, won Harvard, was a career second or third cycle debater. My captain, who got 4th or 5th at Harvard, TOC, and NSDA consistently, was a clear like second or third cycle debater. And more recently in virtual tournaments, you know, the 2021 TOC, the second and fourth place speaker both sponsored. And out of the top 4 speakers, all 4 of them spoke within the first 2 cycles on at least one of the bills. In Yale of 2021, Ethan Wilkes, the champion, sponsored. All of this is to say that sponsoring, while not the only way to win, is a powerful tool. And that often gets lost when you're learning debate because there's a lot of emphasis on the debate aspect of congressional debate, which is refutations and framing, right? So sponsoring isn't like a silver bullet though, and it's not a panacea. There's considerations to make when thinking of when to sponsor, right? For example, in the 2022 TOC, the second to last and the last speaker both went early on both bills. In fact, the last place speaker sponsored the first bill, and the second to last place speaker sponsored the second bill. So there are strategic risks, but there also are strategic benefits. Make sense? Cool beans. So I'm going to go through really quickly what is taught generally to people that want to go early into debate. First AF, first neg, second AF, second neg. How many of you guys have been told that the job of an early round speaker, a sponsor in particular, is to introduce points? Nodding, sort of. Yeah. Yep. How many of you guys have been told to explain the bill? How many of you guys have been told to emphasize solvency? Less so? All right. So the first two definitely come up a lot. Introduce the bill and explain the bill, right? And bring in new points. So this gets brought up really generally. And specifically with the sponsor, there's this format that gets passed around a lot. Problem, impact, solution, right? Have you guys all seen this? Scott's seen this. Senator Manchin from West Virginia has seen this. Alan, you've seen this, right? So these two slides, half right. Problem, impact, solution is a good format. But what ends up happening is, much like CWDI, people think, oh, I need to have a problem. Oh, I need to have an impact. Oh, I need to have a solution. And they don't think why they have to have any of those three, right? And that leads to some common pitfalls. CJ, have you ever thought, why do I need a problem statement? You're muted, by the way. I don't know if you're.
Yeah, not really.
Yeah, it just is, right? It exists.
Yeah, it's kind of part of our format.
Yeah, it's just kind of part of our format. So, Alan, have you thought why do I want to use this structure? Why do you think we want to use the structure?
Like sometimes like I might have this bill where the problem is like really like, clear, and I might have to spend more time on the impact and solution. And then I'm like, because usually they tell you like 50 seconds to like a minute for each part. And then sometimes like I can't occupy the time. So I'm wondering like what I should do with the extra time I have and where I should allocate it.
Correct. Yeah. So what you're saying is I just generally use the structure, but I switch it up sometimes, right? Essentially. All right. So what I've seen a lot of debaters do is that they do problem, impact, solution, and they give okay sponsors, or they give okay early round speeches, right? Because early round speeches, while not following the structure, follow the principles generally, and we'll talk about that. But because the why isn't asked, I've seen three common mistakes. First, a lack of mechanistic warranting in the problem statement. Now that's a pretty like wordy definition. All we're basically saying is the problem is merely a statement of a problem and doesn't warrant why the problem exists. So let me give you an example of a sponsorship that is okay but has some problems on the carbon tax bill. The problem this legislation seeks to solve is climate change. According to a UN climate report in 2019, if we don't take drastic action now, climate change's impacts could be irreversible in the near future. The impact of this is simple. We disenfranchise millions of global citizens. 21.5 billion climate refugees are forced to flee because of the exigent impacts of climate change, rising sea levels, crop loss, extreme weather events. My bill solves this in two ways. First, a $40 carbon tax that reduces emissions. And second, Section 2, which invests that funding into green energy. It's a little condensed, but you guys get the rough idea, right? Is that kind of how you would have sponsored? Yes, no? sort of. Okay. So we're going to start here and we're going to get to an N-level sponsor that goes from like okay to great. So the first problem here, problem in the problem, is that you're not explaining why global warming is occurring uniquely, and most importantly, why this bill solves that, right? So think of it as like the warrant in your claim. So the edit that I've added in here is that global warming, which is caused by an underpricing of carbon emissions, right, is an exigent problem. What's the difference between the first problem and the second problem in red?
You add an explanation of how it happened.
Why the problem is happening, right? That gets missed a lot, even though it's pretty simple. And the reason this is so important is because this ties back into solvency. Because if you're not explaining how the problem is happening, it's going to be a lot more difficult to explain how the bill solves it, right? Because you're going to get to solvency, and then you're going to have to do this anyway. You're going to have to warrant why the problem is happening, right? TLDR, explain the problem. Don't just say it exists. Explain the core causes behind it. Good? Second thing you want to do, or second mistake that I see, broad inactive impacts. So what I mean by an inactive impact is something that just kind of happens in the status quo. For example, the fact that they're climate refugees, right? My impact here is that climate refugees exist. What you want to do in impacting is to say that the bill actively does something good or does something bad, right? So in this case, if I were to run a climate refugees impact, I would run one like this bill actively increases the amount of protections for climate refugees or decreases them, right? But most importantly, you want to have clear quantified impacts in the early rounds of the debate. So here, for instance, my impact is that we reduce 1.6 billion metric tons of emissions annually, which leads to a terminal impact of jobs extending to climate horizon, et cetera, right? Here's what's really important about this, though. You want to pick like sane, achievable impacts. So sometimes when people are in debate, they go for like big picture impacts always, like lives or poverty. It's fine to pick like smaller scale impacts as like a first app or first neg, as long as you could directly link them to the legislation, right? So the mistake that I see people make is that in the solvency section, they explain the bill and then they say, oh, this bill will solve, right? For instance, this bill creates a $40 carbon tax, which naturally solves global warming. What's the problem with that analysis? Because it's true, but why is it problematic? Amber?
You don't say why or how it solves it.
Bingo, right? You don't explain why or how it solves it. Most importantly, you're not answering like how much it solves it. Sorry, I'm getting an email about this Zoom. Cool. Right. So you want to explain the warranting behind how the solvency happens, right? And what's interesting here is that once you notice that the problem is linked to the solvency, because your problem is setting up for your solvency to happen, because you're explaining the warrants behind why the problem is happening, which in turn helps you explain how the bill solves it. Your impact is also linked to the solvency, because oftentimes you want an impact of like what your solvency does. You want to quantify the impacts of the specific mechanisms of your legislation, right? You want to quantify what exactly section 1, section 2, section 3, whatever did. Cool. Now, the third and final mistake that I see people making is not warranting insolvency. We've discussed this, and oftentimes this gets solved when you have an impact that's linked to your solvency, because then you're forced to explain how the impact happens, right? For more complicated bills, though, where you would need to explain the legislation, it's often best to spend some time summarizing, but summarize in terms of the solvency, right? So group the bill specifically on how you think it will solve. So for instance, if I were looking at the carbon tax bill, or a more complicated bill, like a complicated 10-part Latin security omnibus bill, which was debated in MSTOC, right? I would break down the legislation in terms of like what it's supposed to do. Like section A and B is supposed to solve corruption. Section C and D is supposed to catalyze economic development, right? Here's what that would look like in terms of the carbon bill, right? I would create a picture of what the affirmative world would look like in my sponsorship. Instead of just saying section 1 imposes a $40 tax on carbon emissions, I would go a step further and say section 1 imposes a $40 per metric ton tax on emissions. What that means is that companies now have to pay the price for offloading environmental harms onto constituents. Instead of companies being actively incentivized to pollute, their bottom line will force them to adapt eco-friendly practices, right? In that sense, your solvency leads the way to an explanation of what the affirmative world will look like. Yay? Nay? All right, so let's do a quick review really quick. What do you want to do with your problem statement in a sponsorship? Alan.
You state the problem and then you have to explain why the problem occurs and why that's kind of like unique to the bill.
Yep. And why do we want to do that? Why do we want to warrant the problem? Alan again.
If you can warrant the problem, then you can address it when you're trying to prove that the bill's solvent.
Exactly, right? It sets up the solvency of your speech. So they build off of each other. What do we want to do with impacts? Amber?
Talk about what the bill actively does that is good or bad.
Exactly. Active impacts that are bill specific, right? And preferably quantified, right? The strongest impacts that I've seen illustrate with direct numbers like what the legislation does. But depending on the bill and depending on your style, you don't necessarily have to do that. But all of the good sponsors and early round speakers that I've seen have always been bill specific, right? What do we want to do with the solvency section of our sponsors? Someone I haven't heard from, Senator Manchin.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question real quick?
Yeah, sure. What do we want to do with the solvency sections of our sponsorships?
We want to connect it back to the legislation and see how specific parts of the bill will actually create meaningful change.
Right. And the key here is describing the meaningful change. All right. So you would want to describe what an affirmative or negative world looks like. Okay. 3 keys to, did you just commit my, did you just subdivide, Amber?
I don't know who the other Amber Lynn is.
All right. That is quite bizarre. Oh, wait, that might be a judge or something. All right. Cool. So we have about 5 minutes until our mock is supposed to start. Real quick, I'll go through some specific concepts and how that applies to the rest of the debate. So these considerations for sponsorships often carry over into late round speeches, or sorry, not late round speeches, but like the first AF or the sponsor. Same concepts carry over to first nag, second AF, second nag, right? For example, strong second negs are often just sponsorships but flipped. Instead of stating a problem that the legislation solves, they actively prove that a problem will happen if you pass the legislation. An example would be a first neg that talks about the economic harms caused by a carbon tax, right? Oftentimes that harm is then weighed against the sponsor's advocacy, right? Because usually there's costs and benefits to everything, right? No matter what a piece of legislation is or how good it is. Oftentimes in earlier round speeches that aren't the sponsor, refutations should be tied less with specific speakers' points and more their interpretation of the bill mechanistically. If you watch TOC 2021, for instance, you could see the fact that the early round speakers are breaking down the debate first by speaker, but then they're saying like their interpretation of section 1 or section 2 and what it will do, what kind of world it will create is incorrect. And they spend less time directly refuting the point and more time explaining their own version of what the specific bill will do, right? And this often results in a sort of like framing debate, both on a moral level and a bill level. First, early round speakers are trying to establish what exactly the bill will accomplish. AF and neg speakers have different visions of what will happen, right? But the key here is it's not point-based, it's bill-based debate, at least early in the round. Second, it often results in weighing mechanisms, right? Weighing certain values versus one another. Oftentimes, the affirmative or negative will concede that the bill will do something, but then weigh it against something else that the bill does. For example, the affirmative in today's debate might prove climate change will be solved or mitigated by a carbon tax, but the negation can concede that and still say economic harms outweigh, right? Cool. All right. So we have about 4 minutes left. Let's talk really quickly about flipping early. So sometimes you'll have a late round speech prepped and you'll need to flip, but that's pretty easy. Honestly, it's kind of a misnomer that you're flipping when you're going early, because if you've done your prep correctly and you're planning to go late, you should very clearly know the specific solvency mechanisms of the bill that you're debating, right? And then you could often use that and frame your later round argumentation in terms of an earlier round speech. For instance, carbon offshoring is a fairly mid-round argument in the carbon tax debate. For those of you that don't know what that is, it's basically the idea that carbon will go to countries that have less of a carbon tax, right? Companies, for instance, will move to China from the United States because in China, they aren't taxed on their carbon emissions. You could make that a first neg by framing it not in terms of like a ref to other speakers, but in terms of your vision of the bill, right? So I could state that the central affirmative advocacy is that companies in the United States will adapt, right, to a carbon tax by reducing carbon emissions. But that's not true. Companies will do what's in their financial interests. And in this case, it's in their financial interest to avoid being taxed and moving to another tax base, right? Same thing with AF arguments, like late round AF economics arguments that are considered refutations, right? You could flip those in terms of framing. All right, so we'll get started on our mock here in a second. We're still waiting on 2 more judges. But at the end of the slideshow here are some good examples of early round speeches and sponsorships. I think TOC and Yale both had very solid, TOC in particular had 2 very solid sponsorships in 2021. Right, and if you watch the early round debate in both of those bills, the flow is very solid. All right, so to recap, bill specific, what that means is describing what an affirmative or negative world looks like. All early round speakers should be debating their vision or mechanism of what you think the legislation does. You could apply that same logic to non-sponsorship speeches, because on the first neg, second AF, or second neg, you're going to be engaging in a broader debate about what you think the bill will do, right? Good? Yay, nay, awesome, possum. All right, so I think we'll get started on our mock round now. I think our 2 judges are joining very quickly. So as we get started on our mock, can everyone that's participating or judging please turn their cameras on?
Wait, yo, Nick, am I competing or judging?